So let's talk about the possibility of why Giovanni was changed as a flying gym leader to a ground type gym leader. Ultimately, the reason I think Giovanni was changed was because a lot of development costs and all that, and time constraints. I also do think that they probably changed it because one of the major reasons why is because then that way, they could use it against flying types. And at the same time, though, they probably thought that most trainers, it would just be too easy. But then again, ground types are mostly wiped out by water anyway, so they're still too easy to counter. But I guess they also wanted to, because like a lot of the cool Pokemon, they probably thought there was a lot more flying type Pokemon that weren't nearly as powerful as ground types. And I think the reason they also changed it was because they probably thought that they could use like Nidoking, Nidoqueen, Rhydon, Rhyhorn, Dugtrio. And what's really interesting about these Pokemon is even his Rhydon, if you think about it, was the very first Pokemon that was ever drawn. So they probably thought that was probably a lot more interesting than if they just made Giovanni a flying gym leader. Because what's really interesting is they had a scrap. Now, originally they probably would have kept him as a flying type gym leader if all the prototype data would have been there. But this is also assuming that, you would have the Sylph League. Sabrina probably still wouldn't have been the final gym leader. And she also probably would have been... or maybe not, who knows, because again, we'd have to really see what was different and what wasn't. But it's also possible that because Giovanni would have given us like the Earth badge, or the Feather badge, whatever it would have been called, it's very possible that he would have used, if he was using flying type Pokemon, he would have eventually caught Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, because this would still have been under the impression that wild, like legendary Pokemon could very well have been caught more than once. And this is assuming that, and you would assume that like Arcanine was still like a legendary Pokemon because you could catch Arcanine in the prototype version, and I mean, yeah, you could catch Growlithe and evolve it into Arcanine in the final version too. But this was basically people's way of saying, hey, you know what? This is what they were thinking about doing at the time. So legendary Pokemon could evolve and could basically breed puppies and whatnot. Smaller forms, rather. So Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno could have been caught like in a certain area, just like any other wild Pokemon, but you would have to still bring your best Pokemon team because they still would have been a problem to catch because of low catch rates and whatnot. And so it really is possible. It's really trying to figure out like what's true and false about everything else. But they changed a lot of stuff due to time constraints and a lot of... I'm trying to think like what else to say, but I really do think that that's kind of ultimately why Giovanni was a ground type over everything else, because from what we understand in the prototype data and even some of the earlier builds of Pokemon that we've been able to find, a lot of the concept arts they probably changed also kind of made a lot more sense too, because when you think about a legendary Pokemon too, it's rare. You can only catch so many, so you got to be careful with it. You find it, and then it's a static encounter, like right where you find it, and then you fight it there. Say right in front of it, and you just keep trying to catch it until you get it. And so, I do think that kind of made a lot more sense in a way. I do think it kind of would have made more sense too if they would have just kept the concept that legendaries could breed and some of the other ones, because it kind of did make sense. There's definitely more than one Arcanine. There's still... I do think Arcanine's still a legendary to some degree. It's just like people say, a pseudo-legendary, or however you pronounce it. Kind of like Dragonite. Dragons are pseudo-legendaries and whatnot. It's just, he was also... I think they also changed it because the one Pokemon that he was also... His signature Pokemon was supposed to also be a Pokemon that he changed... It was a scrap Pokemon that Farfetch'd evolved into. It was impressive. It was also supposed to be in the Gen 2 prototype, but they scrapped that as well, so it didn't make it in. It was eventually not until Gen 8 that we got Surfetch instead. And that's definitely probably where they got the idea for it, because there was a evolution for Farfetch, but they ended up having to scrap it so many times, but they decided to go back and use some of that old data. And then again, there's also like they probably did the same thing with other legendaries too, or other Pokemon, like Sobble, for example, the water starter in Gen 8. They decided to go back on some Gen 8 Pokemon and Gen 2 Pokemon, Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon that were never released, and they decided to re-release those. So they were taking ideas from previous past dates, and they probably decided, hey, so they decided to reuse them, which still leads me to believe that even to this day, that Game Freak still has these ideas on a computer somewhere. Like, that's how this stuff was leaked to begin with. you know, and we were able to put the pieces together from what we have so far to be able to figure out what Pokemon that was. Now, how many ideas they might have had and how they time-stamped everything, I do think Pokemon, in a way, was still saved the way they wanted it to, but there were probably a lot more ideas they probably didn't cover yet, necessarily, because they were probably still thinking what to do at the time. And again, due to time constraints, too, there's a lot of pressure on game developers, and it kind of makes sense, you know. Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri did state that, you know, even as years went on, they worked on a lot of stuff. They always had ideas ahead of time, but there was just only so much they could do. Not just, I mean, when the first games came out, cartridge limitations and whatnot really were a thing. And I mean, even like the N64 and all that, there's a few games I can think of that they literally ran out of cartridge space, and due to the console programming, there was really nothing they could do, but they couldn't just back it up to another cartridge and then swap that out. They tried it, but they didn't finish utilizing that command, so it didn't. So like every time you try to take a cartridge out, the game freezes, you know. So it's, you know, I get it, you know, when you're recording stuff and programming stuff for a game, there's only so much you can do. But as time goes on, and from what we understand, Pokemon as well as Nintendo, you know, there's just, you have to really think of it like from their perspective. You know, they probably just did the best they could, and it is what it was. You know, they just wanted to create something, but they didn't know how they were going to do it at first, you know, because Game Freak, when they first started developing games, it's always impressive, because I think what a lot of people have gotten wrong about Pokemon over the years was it was like one of the very first games they programmed, because they didn't really know how to do this stuff at the time, and it was one of the most complex games that anybody had ever seen, but it worked, though. It made sense, you know. I just feel like, you know, maybe there were some things that could have changed and fixed, but they probably would have in the long run if the games had more time to develop. I just think that, you know, because like even like games like, I'll give you another example, like games like Deus Ex, the original Deus Ex, the very first one that was released on PC and Macintosh and even the PS2, the one with J.C. Denton. You know, that game was originally supposed to be a little bit longer than what initially was released, but due to time constraints and due to budgets, the game had to be changed and swapped around. And so it wasn't because of cartridge limitations and whatnot. It's just due to, I guess it was just due to development times and all that. But it just like every other game that's ever been released and all that, not just in the series, but like in general, that's usually one problem. It's usually time constraints. But if they did have enough time to work on the stuff they wanted to, and they eventually put it into the final versions, it would have been interesting to see how much different a game would have been, how much longer, how much better, more content. I just think that, you know, it really just goes to show you that, you know, it's like Satoshi Tajiri and Ken Sugimori. I always forget his last name. But what they stated before, when they made Pokemon, it was something they wanted to do. So they had a bunch of ideas, they brainstormed, and, you know, I think Ken even said it best himself, that like every time they come out with a new generation, they always have more ideas. And half those ideas, if not more, get scrapped. You know, so we'll be covering more of that in the future once I find them. But basically, a lot of these Pokemon were scrapped because they probably thought that they just weren't going to use them right away. So they just had to go with it, you know. Wouldn't make sense, you know, creating a Pokemon that's not in the game that you couldn't find anywhere else, you know. So they just had to change everything that they had, you know. So that's why there was no evidence that there were more than 151 Pokemon. They had to do it in a way that it made sense. Like Professor Oak always said, you know, he always stated that there was always more Pokemon waiting to be captured, but like you actually had to find them first. And then we had to move on from that. Then we just had to try to keep looking for them in areas we've never even found them yet. So it makes sense when you really think about it. But anyways, again, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. I'll keep finding more content, and hopefully we can answer some of these mysteries. But until we find more proof, it just goes to show you that it really does make you wonder how many earlier builds they might have that were only accessible on their files and not necessarily out in the public. And if people do have this information somewhere, then, you know, when is it going to get leaked? But I think really it's probably because they're trying to diagnose it, like still trying to figure out like what it is, if they do have it. And who those people are, I couldn't tell you.